Some years ago, I gave this racial literacy talk to a group of lower school teachers, and at the end of it, a white woman, the librarian, walks up to me crying profusely, and I started crying too. Before coming to the University of Pennsylvania, I was a clinical psychologist doing family therapy for abused children and families in 2 residential treatment centers, and I loved doing that work. Because of the way that I watched how families navigated hardship in their lives. And as much as I loved 60 hours a week of doing family therapy, I also saw myself as a scientist, and I wanted to study a particular question of how do Black and brown families protect their children from racial hostility, called racial socialization. So I was excited about this. So when I finally got the opportunity to come to Penn, I had dreams. I dreamt that I'd get the time to write, I'd have colleagues to write, and I had dreams that our colleagues and I would go to the coffee houses around the University of Pennsylvania, and we would read each other's work, we would look into each other's eyes, we would hold hands and skip into the sunset of academic nirvana. Those were my dreams. But I also knew my colleagues might be a little stressed as the only Black faculty member in the department about not only my topic of racial socialization, but my physical presence. So I decided very early on that I was going to shapeshift myself ever so slightly to be the kind and gentle colleague, so that maybe by the end of the first year I could win the Professor of Congeniality Award, and then we could go skipping into that sunset. But unfortunately, after a year trying, shapeshifting a lot, there was no hand holding, no skipping, and I was disillusioned after the first year. In fact, I decided maybe I shouldn't return. And in literally a year later, September 1st, I ran across an article with pictures and photographs that seemed eerily familiar to me, and I decided to read on in this article called Another Country. The first paragraph reads, "It's out there somewhere between the corporate capital of Wilmington and the neon brightness of Delaware's recreational shore. Out there somewhere, after the byways scatter and the pavement goes to dirt, is a place deep within poverty and at the edge of hope." Well, I was intrigued because I grew up in southern Delaware between Milton and Georgetown, which is basically the woods. So I was intrigued about where is this place that they are talking about. And so I moved on and came across Mr. Johnson. After a day picking potatoes, Mr. Johnson takes a rest in a migrant workers camp where he lives. And as soon as I saw the word migrant workers camp, in my mind's eye, I triggered on an image of Jose Santiago. In 1st and 2nd grade, Jose and I were best friends because we got called racial slurs by the white boys, which meant we had to go at recess to fight them on the schoolyard. Now, I can tell you about Jose. Jose was the largest and the biggest person in 1st and 2nd grade. I did not know how old Jose was. I did not care how old Jose was. But whenever Jose was around, we kicked butt. We never lost a fight. But sometimes Jose would be gone for months at a time, and then I got my butt kicked, a very different outcome. And then I moved on to Lakeisha Burton and her friend Cassandra, and when I looked down and saw that they were from Milton, Delaware, I became upset. I got angry because it hit me that they were talking about my people, my neighborhood, as another country. That is not the way that I would describe how our people, we didn't have a lot of money, but these people were not living on the edge of hope. They helped to keep me alive. So I came back to the University of Pennsylvania with a very different resolve, and I said to myself, I belong here at the University of Pennsylvania, but I do not fit in. Have you ever been someplace where you belong, but you don't quite fit in? That's the way I felt, and I defined belonging through the question of, do I accept my difference, my culture, my style, and my competence? And the answer was yes, I do. Whereas I defined fitting in through the question of, do I want to depend on other people's acceptance of my style, my culture, my difference? The answer is no. Especially if shapeshifting is going to be the primary coping strategy for me, because 1, it did not work, and 2, it's kind of grandiose of me to think that I have somehow the power to change the racial fear of another person. There's a cost to this. Now, many of you know about code switching, right? You've heard about it. It comes from the field of linguistics, in which people change their language to try to fit in. I like shape-shifting better than code switching because shape-shifting comes out of the field of Star Trek Next Generation. And part of the notion of shape-shifting is you change more. The psychology is you change more than just your voice. You change your body, you change your walk, you change your personality. Your body, thoughts, and feelings are all engaged. It's much more holistic and much more powerful. I also came across a wonderful African proverb that I still use to this day that goes, "The lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it." And what we mean by this in our work, when we are working people, is we're trying to help them craft their own racial story. And my goal is that they fall in love with their own narrative. But there is a caveat, and we believe that everybody's racial story is powerful and important. My racial story is not better than yours. Yours is not better than mine. But if you don't know your story, somebody will write one for you if you don't. And so in a sense, how do I get to that power is based on, are we willing to excavate our own narratives? And that means that we have to investigate and excavate the part that Wade Nobles, a beautiful psychologist, talked about, the rupture and the splendor of our history in order to be able to get that power out. In our work, we ask people to not only tell their racial story, but to process in a mindfulness approach we call CLCBE, calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale, while they're not only journaling the story, not only telling the story in a pair, not only debating the ruminations that rise up in the story, but also while role-playing. Can they CLCBE? Calculate stands for what feelings am I having currently right now in the moment? And how intense are they on a scale of 1 to 10? To locate them and identify exactly where in your body you feel it and be specific. And also to communicate. What do you notice about your self-talk and images that come to your mind? And then to breathe in slowly and exhale out even slower, such that when you actually become frightened and threatened by a racial stressful moment, doing what Claude Steele calls your brain goes on lockdown, a racing mind, this breathing will help open up your peripheral vision and hearing in the process. We also ask people to use CLCBE while they're talking about their families, and that means bringing pictures. This is my family. I grew up in a multicultural home. For some reason in Delaware, big head genre of photography was a thing. I don't know why they focused on the heads, but my parents were multicultural because they grew up in two different worlds. My father grew up in southern Delaware. My mother grew up in North Philly, and there were no two places different than North Philly and southern Delaware. They both believed that I, as the oldest of my brother Brian and Christy, was supposed to protect my siblings from all enemies, foreign and domestic. But they had different approaches. My father's way of dealing with racial hostility was to have us in church 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His idea was that if anybody bothered us, we were not supposed to get physical because it was a spiritual warfare. We were supposed to pray for folks, knowing that God would get them back in the end. He believed in retaliation. It was just spiritual retaliation. And so he didn't want us to sully ourselves. The people in the church that we used to go to at Georgetown, the AME church, used to preach the same stuff. I love these people. In Sunday school, they gave us candy. As a teenager, I hated these people because they were always in my business and they told on me to my parents. And as an adult, I fell in love with them again because of the way their prayers helped to keep us alive. So you can imagine why I was upset by that article. My mother, on the other hand, had a different policy. She grew up in a racially segregated neighborhood and had to fight on her way to and from Simon Gratz High School in North Philadelphia. Not only did my mother instruct me that I could fight physically if somebody bothered me or my brother and sister, she believed that I could pick up inanimate objects in the cause. She was just as vociferous in her arguments in this house. Can you imagine what it's like being in a home with two very strong-willed people arguing their positions? Now, in our work, we ask people not only to bring pictures, but to talk about their family. My sister is a wonderful musician, right? In many respects, she followed in the course of my mother. My mother did not quite fit into southern Delaware. There was a way in which she bothered the black and brown people because they thought she was city and too haughty. She didn't act like them, and she bothered the white folks. When my mother came to Southern Delaware, when we would go to the public thoroughfare, she would take us with us. And when we go into those spaces and people would stare at her because she was different, it bothered her to watch black and brown people be physically deferential in the presence of whites. My mother was never deferential. When she wanted to go somewhere, she walked. And she walked with a certain energy. And the three of us had to keep up with her. We could not be late because we were going to a war zone. She would give us 2 racial socialization talks, one that included loving, caring, opening us to literature, art, music, and the contribution of black people in all of those things. She was an excellent musician. She showed us Emmett Till's Mangled Body from Jet and explained to us what that meant. She went into debt to buy World Book encyclopedias just so that we could have access to the way the world was. We were the only family in the neighborhood that had World Book encyclopedias. Some of the kids in the neighborhood would come over and say, "Can I borrow S?" And I say, "It's ST, man, come on, ST." That's how much she was loving and caring to socialize us about blackness in the world. But the other talk happened in the parking lot of the Acme supermarket. It was there in the back of the car. She would start the conversation like this, and she was sad, and she was aggressive, and she was angry, and she was stressed. She said, "When we get into the store, I don't want you to ask for nothing or touch nothing. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" We said nothing because we knew she wasn't finished. Sometimes she would stare at us in the car. Sometimes she would get out of the car, look up into the sky as if to call on God, get back in the car, and start the conversation as if she had never left. "I don't care what other children are in this store. They're climbing on the walls. They're not my children. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" And we said, "Yes, Mom," in 3-part harmony. The reality of this is that she would give us this talk over and over and over again. But we never acted up. We were too scared to act up because we were in church 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I was always afraid as a teenager that when I'm making my first romantic move and encounter, my whole church would show up right in the middle of it. The praying lady would come out of one corner, start praying the house down, and the choir would come out another corner singing, "Oh, Happy Day." In my teenage mind, I couldn't do it. We never acted up. So why does this woman give this talk over and over and over again? It's because she was trying to teach us a first racial socialization skill, and that skill is, it's not enough for you to see that you're beautiful and handsome and smart. You also have to see how other people do not see you that way, and that is important. It was at the Acme supermarket that we had the most struggles. When we walked into the Acme supermarket, you could feel the tension. And some days, nothing happened. But on the worst days, the person behind the counter would be upset by my mother's way. They'd have to do something or say something to put her in her place. And the worst thing they could do was at the end of the sale to throw my mother's food into the bag. And when that happened, it was on. My brother and sister and I started talking. You probably don't want to mess with my mother today. Today is not the day, but it was too late. She would start in on the person, talk about who they were, who their family was, where to go, how fast to get there. If you haven't been cursed out by a black mother from North Philadelphia, you have not lived. Skydiving and being cursed out by a black mother, yes. She was on fire. She was awesome, the way that she mowed down disrespectful people in the supermarket. And at the same time, we were scared and stressed. Now, those are 2 strategies that my parents taught us. One is that sometimes you got to pray, you got to plan, you got to prepare. But other times you got to protest, you got to speak up and say something. And those are 2 key strategies that we try to teach folk as they're telling their racial story about how to navigate. I told you my sister grew up to be a wonderful musician. My brother is a famous lawyer. His name is Brian. He wrote a book called Just Mercy. He's an advocate on behalf of those around the country, especially around those disenfranchised by mass incarceration and the death penalty. You can see here early on, he had a suspicion about injustice with the photographer in this photograph. So what are we saying? Everybody has a racial story. My racial story is not better than yours. Yours is not better than mine. But if you don't excavate your own narrative, somebody will write one for you. But everybody's not going to like your story. And that's why I love this poem by Nayirah Waid, who says, some people, when they hear your story, contract. Others, upon hearing, expand. And this is how you know. So our assumptions in our work is, one, discrimination is violence. Racism harms health through stress and trauma that goes unaddressed. Society teaches us how to run, to fight, and to freeze when it comes to these moments, to avoid. Legal remedies will not heal the trauma that we're talking about. And racial competence is way more important than being a nice person or a good person. Racial stress, if we don't tackle it, will disrupt not only our competence, but it will undermine our ethics and our morality. And finally, the research on this work is very powerful about how racial socialization and literacy buffers racial stress. I believe we can change racial outcomes in proximal spaces. The literature on racial stress and threatening is enormous, particularly because of how, when we are in these moments, before, during, and after these moments, the stress is so high that it overtaxes our ability to regulate our feelings, our body reactions, and our cognitions. And we need all of these in order to find our voice. The research on how racial stress and trauma affects not only our mental well-being, but our physical well-being is very powerful. We talk about Steele's racing mind, our minds go on lockdown, and how do we open that up in the moment? Racial battle fatigue, the ruminations, worrying when somebody else is going to step to me. And this presumption of dangerousness is all a part of producing the kinds of negative health outcomes above other factors in men, women, and children. When we think about racial threat, the idea that it is so exhausting that it distorts our perception of people as being closer than they really are, larger than they really are, and older than they really are, it's a problem. This is not only just true for adults. If I asked you which grade do you think children or students of all racial groups are expelled the most, and I do this around the country since 2005, most people tend to say 7th and 8th grade. And I think it has nothing to do with the question. I think they hated themselves in 7th and 8th grade. I think they hated people looking at them in 7th and 8th grade. The answer is pre-K. And if you look at Walter Gilliam's wonderful work, he's a good friend who was once at Yale, he's now in Nebraska. He's done this work over and over again. And this is a racial problem and an adult problem, not a child problem, but 3 times the rate of K through 12, and particularly for children of color, black boys in particular. And he describes it as egregious overreactions by adults driven by their biased expectations and fears. This is a kind of racial threat. So it happens across the lifespan. And if it does happen to our little ones and our older ones, how do we manage the hate as it harms our bodies? How do we heal from it? Well, we have to change our definition of racial socialization. Some of my colleagues here in the audience have been helpful. It is not just what parents give to young people that matters. It's also what young people get that they can use when somebody steps in your face. And you need skills, you need emotional skills, you need intellectual skills, and you need behavioral strategies to protect and affirm your sense of self. The research on the benefits of racial socialization for people of color is also pretty powerful across the lifespan. For preschoolers, improved thinking and behavioral competence. For protection against sleep problems in elementary school students. For anger management and academic achievement outcomes in teenagers, and even for parents who have the talent and the skill to give the talk in the way they want to give it, feeling like their children get the talk the way they hope they would get it, can reduce their sense of worrying about their children being racially profiled. In a study with Dr. Jackson Collins, who is the executive director of Prep for Prep, we did a study on students of color in predominantly white independent schools, and we found that the more they reported stress from discrimination with teachers and peers, the more they perceived their school as a threatening space. The one caveat, though, that's not hard to understand, but the caveat is if they felt they had some racial coping confidence to deal with those moments, they thought of their space as less threatening than their counterparts. The same is true around belonging. Those who had more racial coping self-efficacy had more sense of belonging than their counterparts. It's a buffering process. When we look at white families and racially stressful encounters, the study and the research by some is growing that white youth underestimate their racial biases, more likely to hold biases disfavoring Black and favoring non-Black people at early ages, and less likely to develop the regulation skills we know as helpful for managing these face-to-face encounters. What white parents can do, besides just give colorblind racial socialization, is that by talking to children, not only can they increase their sense of understanding and lowering their racial biases, but they can also teach them to stand up and confront at ages earlier than eight years old, to confront other children's biases in real time. The theory that we put together called RECAST is about illuminating that racial socialization is helpful because of how it helps regulation and builds confidence. The problem is that that's not enough, because parents, when they give the talk, they get stressed. They remember things that bother them that they have not yet resolved, and that undermines the conversation. And so competency, how confident we are, what's our regulation strategy matters. Hence, racial literacy. Racial literacy is an advancement on racial socialization. It's the ability to read, recast, and resolve before, during, and after moment. Reading is, do I see the racial elephant in the room? Do I see and decode the racial scripts? Recasting is this ability, if I'm at an 8, 9, and 10 of anger and fear, how do I reduce it to a 5, 6, or 7 where I can make some sense of it and problem solve through CLCBE? And resolving is, do I make a healthy decision not to avoid, but to engage this and stop pretending that this didn't bother me when it really did bother me? The work on confronting prejudice is also quite powerful in improving health, mental well-being, reducing those ruminations, and disrupting future use of stereotypes by offenders. In our work, we've been doing for over a decade, teaching young people how to give back healthy racial comeback lines, which is basically to say, I reject your rejection of me. In a study we just finished of 1,000 young people, randomly assigned to 3 groups, 2 racial literacy interventions, 1 with healthy racial comeback lines, 1 without, showed significant improvement in that recasting ability. We've been involved in this work of racial literacy with teachers and students in schools, with barbers and their patrons, in barbershops, with coaches and youth on playgrounds, and with families trying to make it better. And we've also hung out on Sesame Street. If you ever get a chance, go to Sesame Street. And these are some of the strategies we use. When we find that people are working on them, they initially get the sense of sadness, shame, anger. But if we ask them to tell a recasting story, 10 minutes later, you get sadness, but you also get other emotions that matter in how we're going to go forward on these issues. Take-home points: we can change racial outcomes in proximal spaces. The question is, are you prepared? Martin Luther King talked about it in a letter from a Birmingham jail. He said, you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised. He's having a racial stress response right in the middle of this writing. He says, see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky. And that's why we are here, to keep those ominous clouds from forming. So, giving this talk some years ago, a white woman, the librarian, comes up to me crying profusely. And I started to cry. I wasn't really crying because it was just that I'm an empath. I mean, I see other people getting into it, my tear ducts kick in. Because usually some people are angry at what I say. I didn't know what she was coming with. But she said, Dr. Stevenson, I want you to know that I know about Georgetown, Delaware. I said, right. She said, I know about that Acme supermarket in Georgetown, Delaware, because my father was a butcher in the store. And I said, get out of here. What I really meant to say, get the hell out of here. And she said, I know about the racist attitudes about those people in that store because my father had those racist attitudes. And when she said that, I cried for real. She went on to talk about her father and how her father was was struggling because he only got through a 6th grade education, and people pummeled him and treated him badly. And she said, I know that he took it out on other people, but there's more to my father than just this narrative. And it brought me back how she fought on behalf of her father. And it brought me to this article again of this father and son doing their homework after school, him for his GED, and this sibling getting evicted. There's more to their story than what we saw in that article. And I came to the conclusion that the history of this country is not about how we get from rags to riches. It's about whose story gets told and whose gets distorted. It's about how ignorant and hateful we are about other people's racial stories. It's about how it's healing to find our voice of resistance and say, that's not my story. So what's your racial story? And when are you going to find and use your outside voice? Thank you very much.